Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. We're often taught that colonization was about discovery, about brave European explorers finding new lands. But what if that's the wrong story? What if colonization didn't discover the world, but instead broke it and put it back together in a way that would benefit Europe for centuries to come? Let's talk about it. Before Europeans arrived, most of the world was already discovered, inhabited, and thriving. Africa had its vast empires. Asia was home to highly advanced states and cultures. The Americas boasted complex civilizations. These societies weren't waiting in the dark to be found. They had their own systems of trade, politics, and knowledge. So colonization wasn't about discovery, it was about reorganization. It was a massive global project to restructure societies for one primary purpose: to enrich Europe. Let's break down how this happened in four key areas. First, the economic reorganization. Colonies were turned into giant supply closets for Europe. Africa was plundered for raw materials like gold, rubber, and cocoa. The Americas were transformed into massive plantations for sugar, cotton, and tobacco, often powered by enslaved people. Asia became the source for spices, tea, and silk. Local economies that once produced for their own people were systematically destroyed or reshaped. They were forced to produce cash crops for export and in turn had to import expensive finished goods from Europe. This created a cycle of dependency that has been incredibly hard to break. The basic pattern we see today, where the global South exports cheap resources and the global North controls finance and industry, wasn't an accident. It was designed this way. Second, let's look at the political reorganization. Think about a map of Africa or the Middle East, those straight lines and sharp angles. They weren't drawn by locals. They were drawn in conference rooms in Europe by colonial administrators who had little to no understanding of the people living there. They split ethnic groups apart, forced rival communities into the same state, and dismantled traditional political systems that had worked for centuries. The result? Artificial, fragile states prone to conflict and instability. Many of the political crises we see today are a direct legacy of these colonial borders. The lines on the map created divisions on the ground that continue to cause pain. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, was the social reorganization. Colonization wasn't just about controlling land and resources. It was about controlling people's minds. It created a global racial hierarchy with Europeans at the top, labeled as civilized, and everyone else at the bottom, labeled as backward or primitive. This twisted logic was used to justify slavery, forced labor, and the erasure of entire cultures. This hierarchy didn't just disappear with independence, it lingers today in our beauty standards, in our education systems, in media portrayals, and even in who gets a visa and who doesn't. Colonization taught people to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressors, a psychological wound that runs deep. Fourth, there was a reorganization of knowledge itself. Colonial education taught that European history was world history. Local knowledge was dismissed as primitive folklore, while Western science was presented as the only universal truth. Students in colonized lands learned about Shakespeare but not about their own ancestral heroes. They were taught to value degrees from foreign universities more than the wisdom of their own elders. This created an intellectual dependency, a belief that true knowledge and validation could only come from the West. The colonized were taught to be strangers in their own lands, looking at their own culture as something to be overcome. So when we look at the world today, what do we see? The wealthiest countries are almost all former colonizers. The poorest are overwhelmingly former colonies. The major global institutions, like the World Bank and the IMF, were created by colonial powers, and the rules of global trade often favor industrialized nations. This isn't a coincidence, it's a structural inheritance. The world economy was built during the Age of Empire, and it was never fundamentally redesigned after empire supposedly ended. Many colonies gained political independence in the 20th century. Flags were raised, national anthems were sung. But did that mean true liberation? For most, the answer is no. The economic structures remained in place. The artificial borders stayed, the cultural hierarchies persisted, and global power remained concentrated in the hands of the few. This is what many scholars call neocolonialism. The flags changed, but the fundamental power relations did not. This is why it is a mistake to think of colonization as something that is in the past. It's not just a chapter in a history book. We are living inside its afterlife. It lives on in unequal trade deals, in global poverty patterns, in the debt traps that keep developing, nations down, and in whose voices are considered credible on the world stage. The deepest truth is this: colonization didn't just take land, it rewired economies, it reordered cultures, it redefined what it meant to be human. It froze a moment of global inequality into a permanent structure. The modern world isn't a neutral playing field. It is history designed and implemented. Ultimately, colonization wasn't just a single event or a series of events. It was, and in many ways still is, a system. A system that continues to operate today, just with new language, new institutions, and new masks. We may be post-independence, but we are still living in a world shaped by a colonial structure. That's why the past feels so unfinished. It's why the world feels so fundamentally unequal. And it's why the fight for justice has to be historical, not just political, because history didn't end with colonization. We are all right now living inside its consequences. Understanding this isn't about guilt or blame. It's about clarity. It's about seeing the world for what it is, so we can begin to imagine what it could be. Thanks for watching. If this gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing and sharing. See you next time.